this working? Yeah. Thank you. My slides up? I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. It's a great pleasure to be here, to see you all here. And okay, thank you. All right, okay, so. All right, so this is the title that I'm going to talk about. It's based around my book, La Grande Évasion, which has just been translated into French. And it's about human progress and inequality. These great episodes of human progress are what I call the Great Escape. And what do I mean by that? I mean the escape from destitution, from ill health and premature mortality, which characterized most of human lot for much of human history. That's where we came from, and where we came to is where many of us who live in rich countries are fortunate enough to have today, which is a much longer life and much higher material living standards. I'm going to talk about health and living standards mostly, but there's many other good things going on, other escapes. There's better governance in the world, there's a lot more democracy. There have been large-scale reductions in violence in spite of some horrible flare-ups. There have been huge increases in education, especially for girls around the world. And there have been big increases in life evaluation, or if you might want to call it happiness. So what do these escapes do? I mean, they make the people who escape way better off. That's wonderful. But of course, what happens is the nature of human progress is that not everybody escapes at the same time. Some people escape, some people are left behind. So that means that these episodes of progress are engines of inequality. It would be nice if the world were such that everybody escaped at the same time, but that's not actually what happens, and you can't have progress without inequality. And one of the things I'm going to talk about this evening is, in these episodes, what are we to think of the inequality that results? Many people really hate inequality, and they say the world would be better if it had less. But I'm going to give you a more mixed message than that there are good things and bad things about inequality. Now, you know, the most famous escape is the escape that came with sustained economic growth in Northwest Europe between 1750 and 1850, the Industrial Revolution. It sowed the seeds of the increases in material living standards and the increases in life expectancies that we live with today. But of course, what it didn't happen in all countries in the world at the same time. I mean, it happened in Britain, it happened in Holland, and then it happened in Sweden and France. And what it did was to pull those leading countries away from their neighbors and from the rest of the world. So those gaps that opened up 250 years ago are largely still with us. So the huge differences in health between Africa and Europe, between India and North America, those gaps have been there for a really, really long time, both in income and in health. And they trace back to this wonderful event, the industrial and health revolutions that really made the world so much a better place. Now, we used to think, when I first studied the Industrial Revolution, that it used to be that this was the first time in human history that mankind, any part of mankind, had ever been rich. But you know, that's really not true. There have been many escapes in the past. My favorite story is about Admiral He in China. And Admiral He had this ship here, which was, he used a fleet of those ships to sail to Africa, and they could have conquered the world. And showing you next to that tiny little ship is Christopher Columbus's ship, which of course did change the world. I love this picture because it tells you of the enormous advantages of Chinese over Western technology in the 15th century. Admiral He sailed many, many years before Christopher Columbus. And if he hadn't been pulled back and told not to sail anymore, the Chinese would have been the ones that took over the world rather than the Europeans. So the question was, why did these escapes not last? So the issue is not that there were no escapes somewhere else, but simply that they didn't go on, that China didn't go on being rich. And a lot of happened there was bad politics. That's a very simple way of putting it. But the rulers who were in charge were terrified of these advances and stopped them. And of course, the reason they could do that was they were very rich and they were very powerful. So I think of this as an early example of inequality pulling back economic progress. So I want to talk about what's been happening over the last 50 years. And this picture is what I think of as the onward and upward picture. Let me explain it very quickly. Along the horizontal axis along the bottom, it shows GDP per capita. So richer countries are on the right, poorer countries are on the left. On the vertical axis, you can see life expectancy at birth, which is around 30 in the very poorest countries in Africa and goes up to beyond 80 in countries like Japan. Each blob on the graph shows you a country. The size of the circles, the area of the circles is proportional to the population of the country. So you can see the huge China there, India just beneath it. And there's two graphs, one for 2010 and one for 1960. And you can see what's happened over this period, which is that countries are moving from the bottom left up to the top right. And as they do that, they get richer and they get healthier. This is just the world getting to be a better place. And you can see that in 1960, the world was much poorer than it was in 2010. And people were moving up, the countries were moving up the curve, getting richer, and moving up the curve to the right, which made them richer, and moving up the curve upwards, which is showing how much healthier and how much long-lived they were. Now, that's a very optimistic, positive picture. I mean, this is a planet getting better and better and better in both health and income. But, you know, it wasn't entirely like that. So let me show you this picture. This is basically the same picture you saw a minute ago, but I changed the colors so you can see something that's going on. And the holographs just are done to make it easier to see. The red blob there, which I'm going to talk about, is South Africa. And this starts in 1960, and I'm going to roll this forward 10 years at a time. So the one at the very bottom left there, which is between 30 and 40, and very, very poor, that's China. It's the biggest circle on the graph in 1960. Now watch what happens to China as we go from 1960 to 1970. It jumps up from 30-odd to around over 60. So I'm going to go back if I can. I'm not sure that works. Yeah, there you are. And there's China at the bottom left, and then China 10 years later. Now you might say, how could some country make such huge progress? How can they go from 30 years of life expectancy to 60 years of life expectancy in only a decade? Well, the answer, of course, was what was happening in 1960, which is one of the great catastrophes of modern times, which was the so-called Great Leap Forward, when something like 30 million people died because of insane economic policies in China. So that was an example where it doesn't always go up. It's going up here, not because there was great progress in 1960, but because of the, in 1970, but because of the catastrophe in 1960 that came before that. Now let me focus on South Africa. South Africa is way below the countries that you would expect it to be, and that's essentially because of apartheid. That South Africa was a country divided, and it was like a small white country mixed in with a huge African country. And so even though income was very high, its health on average was really very poor. But as we go through the years, South Africa is moving up with everybody else. So 1980, it's getting closer to the curve. Apartheid is breaking down. 1990, it's almost where it should be. Things are getting much better. And then in 2000, South Africa just falls off the end of the world. So what we're looking at there, of course, is the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And the HIV/AIDS epidemic is another force, another catastrophe that took life expectancy backwards in much of Africa in around 1990 to 2000 and the years beyond. So my message is an optimistic one, but it's not a crazily optimistic one. Things do go wrong, and when things go wrong, we can lose a lot of progress. Let me turn to the world as a whole and talk about poverty and happiness. And again, I want to switch into optimistic mode. These are the World Bank data from 1980 to 2012, showing the number of poor people in the world measured in millions. So if you look at the black line on top, which is the total number of poor people in the world, there were 2,000 million or 2 billion people who were living under $1 a day, now moved up to $2 a day, but in complete destitution in 1980. 2 billion people. I mean, an enormous scar on the face of the planet. If you look at that, you can see steady decline, not very fast up until 2000, but after 2000, really quite rapid progress and falling poverty worldwide. So we get to 2012, and you know, these numbers are not perfect, but I don't think anyone thinks the general pattern here is wrong, which is that we've eliminated I don't know who we is, but there has been this huge reduction in global poverty from 2 billion people to under 1 billion people in a period of 30 years or so. That is really one of the most amazing achievements in mankind's history. There has never been a reduction of poverty on this scale anywhere in the world in human history. And if you think the world looks like a pretty bad place today and a pretty dangerous place, this is the graph to remember. Just remember this huge reduction in global poverty, the world getting better. Now, many people say, well, it was mostly China. Well, China was certainly very important, but if you take China out of this, you get the blue line, and you can see that since 2000, there's been pretty rapid poverty decrease in the world, other than in China, or China as well as in China. And even sub-Saharan Africa, which has been the lagging continent, you can see here that since 2000, there's been some poverty decline even there. So this is another way in the world is getting a really much better place. Some of us like to look at the world in another measure, which is to ask people how happy they are, or maybe not happiness, but what we ask people here is, how's your life going on a scale from 0 to 10? We call this the ladder. And then you take the average in each country, and here you plot it in the same way as I've been doing. Notice the axis along the bottom is 800, 3,200, 12,800, so I'm multiplying by 4 for every mark. And what you can see here is this very, very strong relationship between income, GDP per capita, and how well people's lives are going. You know, the country that always wins this thing is Denmark, up there at the top. But look at the countries in Africa at the bottom. Look at Burundi, look at Sierra Leone, Togo. Those people really know their lives are terrible. And if you ask them how their lives are going, they'll tell you just how bad they are. The countries in blue are East Asian countries that tend to do relatively poorly relative to their income. The green countries are countries in Latin America where people tend to be much happier than perhaps they ought to be. We don't really understand those. Perhaps it's just the way people report answers to these questions. I wanted to show you inequalities in health too. That I said already that in Britain in the middle of the 18th century, life expectancy began to rise, and that led to a good deal of inequality in life chances. I have a picture here which shows life expectancy in Britain from before 1550 up to about 1850, and this is the general population. And you can see it's very variable. There are plagues and horrors that come along. And there's not a whole lot of trend. So it's oscillating around 40, sometimes a lot lower than 40. You know, this is not a great time to be alive. Now, one of the things that you can look at on this graph, which is an interesting question, is what happened to the dukes? What happens to the British aristocrats during this period? Do they do better? Do they do worse? Well, if you plot the life expectancy of the aristocrats on this picture, you get this amazing picture, which is up until about 1750, there really wasn't any difference. And if anything, the aristocrats did a little worse than the ordinary people. But something happened after 1750 which pulled the ducal families, the rich families, away from the common population. We don't exactly know what that was, but the Enlightenment had a lot to do with it. People spent a long time trying to do better for themselves, spending a lot of time thinking about their health. Inoculation for smallpox came from China, Turkey, and Africa to Europe, to the United States. Quinine was discovered from Peru, was known there all along, and other medications. All of these innovations were good, they were benevolent, they were expensive, and they later spread more widely to the whole of the population. But, you know, the rich got them first. Now, we might say that's terribly unfair, it's unjust, these are the worst sort of inequalities, and many people think that. But that's the way the world is. These inequalities came because someone got this first, and everybody moved along. Not everybody. I like to give the example of Jonathan Edwards, was one of America's most distinguished theological philosophers. He was an Enlightenment figure. He very much believed in inoculation. And pour encourager les autres, he inoculated himself to prove that this worked for smallpox, and he died within 3 days. So it doesn't work for everybody. What about health in rich countries today? Well, there's lots of good things going on, lots of innovations. Antihypertensives, statins have brought down cardiovascular disease. Cancer is actually beginning to show signs of being beaten back. People are smoking much less than they used to be, even in France, I guess. And people quitting smoking has actually widened health inequality. And all of these new interventions. Poorer people are less likely to be screened, they're more likely to be smoking, and less likely to be using antihypertensives. So you might again say these health inequalities are very unfair and we really don't like them. But once again, we can argue that these technological changes, these benefits are going to come to everybody eventually, and therefore we should smile on this inequality because it's a sign of progress that's really going to come. Again, there are exceptions. You know, we've known for 50 years that cigarette smoking is really bad for you, and yet the benefits have still not spread equally throughout the whole population. Poorer people are much more likely to smoke and much more likely to die from heart disease and lung cancer that comes with the smoking habit. Which brings me to thinking about income inequality. You see, I think health inequalities are not so bad because they indicate good things that are to come. Income inequality is another matter altogether. And as almost everybody here will know, economic growth has been faltering in the rich world, and income inequality has been growing apace, especially in Britain and the United States. But even in France, which for a long time held off against this, you now see rising inequality in France too. Now, some of this is like the health inequalities, that it signs that life is getting better. So one story that people would tell is that technical progress has changed and education is now much more valuable than it used to be. So educated people's salaries go up and people who are not so educated salaries stay where they are. That raises income inequality. But there's a good side to that too, which is the people who's lost out in this can see what they have to do in order to escape from their situation. They have to go to school, they have to get educated. That increases educational attainment, at least for a while, and will help bring inequality back down again. So people on the right who talk about inequality tend to emphasize this sort of story, that inequality is about incentives, and it really does make good things happen. The trouble is there's a bad side of inequality too. And when we see the data in the United States, you see a lot of the worst in it, well, the strongest gain in inequality is coming from people getting paid enormous salaries at the very top. And why are they getting that? It's not clear they're getting it because they're worth more. And a lot of it is what we worry about, the rich capturing the political process, getting to write the rules for their own benefit, what economists call rent-seeking, that people go to the government and try to get special favors. They get exemptions from all sorts of rules, and this can make them very, very rich. And if you look at what's happened in the banks in the United States, the pharmaceutical companies, a lot of the healthcare industry, a lot of the military supply industry, a lot of that increase in inequality has come from people who are not producing stuff. They're not inventing iPods and iPads. They're not curing cancer. They're not doing things that benefit all the rest of us. They're actually doing things that hurt the rest of us. And that is quite unconscionable. So I've summarized the sort of right position here. No sin to get rich by benefiting everyone through innovation and growth, but it's really iniquitous to get rich by lobbying governments to get special favors that hurt everyone. So rent-seeking, I think, is the real evil behind the modern growth in inequality at the top. So let me conclude by coming back to thinking about the world as a whole. And there are indeed still huge global inequalities around the world. And I know many people here and many people at this meeting have been talking about their efforts to try and diminish those inequalities by working in poor countries around the world. Now, if you think about life expectancy, infant and child mortality rates are basically what drive these huge gaps in life expectancy. Children in the poor world are dying simply because of where they were born. A child that dies in the Central African Republic of diarrheal disease or a respiratory infection would not have died had they been born in France, or very, very unlikely to have died. And it just seems an extraordinary injustice that children around the world should die because of the accident of where they were born. Many people, when they think of health in Africa, think that people are dying of exotic incurable diseases like Marburg virus or Ebola. But that's not really what people are dying of. The big killers of children in developing countries are childhood diarrhea and respiratory infections. And we've known how to cure or prevent those for the best part of a century. So people are dying there because of social arrangements. They're not dying because we don't know how to cure the diseases of which they suffer. I've spent a lot of my career working in India. Half of all children in India are severely malnourished. They're way shorter than they should be. They're way skinnier than they should be. And if you look at women and men, in fact, in India, they're among the shortest people in the world. So it seems to me, as I'm sure it seems to all of you, that we have a clear ethical obligation to assist people who are living in such poverty and such poor health around the world. So the question I raise in my book, and the question that worries me a lot, is how we should do that. So let me start by being positive, which is there's lots of things we can really do to help. Much of the research in the United States on disease is focused on the diseases of rich people who live in the United States, who are, after all, paying taxes to pay for that research. But there's a lot more we could do, devoting some of our foreign aid money to research on malaria, on other diseases that are not really important in rich countries, but are terrible in poor countries. We can do things like help the World Bank and other places, McKinsey, other organizations can do this to provide high-quality consulting services to poor countries. When countries are negotiating multilateral trade deals, of which we've heard a lot about recently, countries like the US and France are represented by armies of lawyers and very skilled negotiators. If you're a poor country, you don't have any of that. There's no reason why we should not pay, if we really want these people to get better off, pay for them, pay for negotiators, pay for lawyers to help them work on a more level field. We should make it much easier for poor people around the world to sell their goods in the European Union and in North America. And one of the most puzzling things to me is the countries in Europe that are most determined to give aid, including France, Holland, Sweden, and Britain. With one hand, they're giving aid, and with the other hand, they're selling guns to the same countries. I have yet to hear an argument as to why, if you really want to help people, you should be sending them guns. It makes not the slightest bit of sense to me. We're doing it presumably because our constituents in our home countries want to sell guns to someone, and the government is helping them rather than trying to stop them. So I've listed some other things there. This is what is sometimes called the global public goods agenda, that the rich countries can pay for facilities that help the poor countries to prosper in the world in a way that is hard for them now. I, however, have become quite skeptical about large aid flows into poor countries. There are many countries in Africa and a bunch of other countries around the world who get almost all of their government expenditure from foreign aid. So many countries in Africa, they're not raising taxes, they don't need to raise taxes because the government can get all of its money from the aid industry. What that then does is it cuts responsibility of these governments to their own citizens. And we see this all over Africa. And there's a deep undermining of the government that people need in poor countries in order to grow and prosper. So for me, in those countries where, say, more than half of government expenditure is coming from abroad, I think we need less aid and not more. People often say, when I say this, well, what about aid for health? What about all these antiretrovirals that we're helping Africa buy with aid? And we save many, many lives. And I agree with that, and it's true. I have never argued against, and in fact, I've argued in favor of that sort of aid. But what we have to recognize, of course, is even that sort of aid has negative side effects in undermining domestic provision and in helping making governments not responsible to their citizens. Nevertheless, the ethical obligation, I think, we can fulfill by looking at the more positive things that I just talked about, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Deaton. It was really exciting, and I wish I could have had a very big debate with you. Unfortunately, I'm a pure literary mind, so I can't, but hopefully we have Jacques Attali, who's a pure economic mind in other stuff, and will tell us what he thought about this debate.
Thank you very much for this very profound and global analysis of the situation. We have not a lot of time, therefore I would just make 2 or 3 comments and then we discuss. First, I fully agree with what you said at the end, back the fact that giving the money to the governments is a terrible mistake. I was against that since more than 20 years when it has been decided by the so-called international community to rely on the responsibilities of governments and to get rid of any direct actions in order not to interfere with the societies. It's a mistake and this should be changed, and it is not. Second, of course, I agree with figures, fascinating figures that you gave on the past and on the situation today. But for the sake of the conversation, let me insist on what we could disagree. One, as you know, poverty cannot be defined only by the $1 or $1.25 or $2. There are much more things. You know that more than 3 billion people have no water, and many other things indicate that poverty, as you have said, to India. Second, what we see for the future it could be seen as things worsening and not improving directly. First, innovation is increasing inequalities because innovations go to the early adopters and then it is deploying. But when a new innovation comes, a new wave comes very soon, there's no time for unequal deployment before a new one happens. Third, demography. Demography is going, unfortunately, to be high in poor countries and not in wealthy countries, and the African situation is the worst. As you know, in the next 15 years, we'll have 1.5 new billion people on Earth. 600 will be in Africa, and something like 200 million will be in only in the Sahel, which is, and you saw this sub-Saharan Africa being stable, but it will be terribly worsening in the next 15 or 20 years in terms of poverty because it's falling states and not a lot of, and therefore I would say that even if you can say that as we speak the situation could be seen as under control, on the next 15 years it is not. Therefore, you know that there is one pending question, and I would focus our discussion on that if you don't mind. As you said, now the world is one, global. We agree on COP21 on environment issue, climate as one. And you said, and I share your view, that now we cannot stand the fact that some people are poor while we are rich, while in the past we could be deaf and dumb because we were in other continents. What to do? Would you be in favor of what? Only trying to help them by putting them in position to help themselves, as we do. A Positive Planet is helping people to take care of their own case. Or would you dream of an international tax system that will organize transfers to the poor through a tax on climate or tax on energy or whatever? What would be your global recipe on that?
Yeah, you're much more pessimistic than I am, which is and
Pessimistic but active.
yeah, well, that's right. So I'm optimistic and not so active. I
Not
worry a
because-
lot about unintended consequences, which is something that I suppose makes me sort of conservative. It's certainly a banner of conservatives that you should be very careful about unintended consequences. I agree with much of what you said, but not all. So let me say, I think transfers into states, whether by governments or NGOs on large scales, don't work. And I think that's been a very hard position for me to come to, and I've thought about it very hard over the years. I like to give this example. If you're living in your street and the house next door becomes for sale, and some very strange person moves in with his wife, and this person belongs to a cult, like a satanic cult or something, that believes in enslaving women. And so he exploits his wife and will give her almost nothing. And you would really like to help her wife. Now, you wouldn't help the wife by giving the man money, because, of course, what sense does that make? But you wouldn't even help by giving the woman money either. So the direct aid won't work because it just all goes to the man. And in fact, what you might do better is to give money to the man, provided he gives some of it to the woman, so you could make conditions. The trouble with that, historically, in the aid analogy, is that if countries try to cut back like that, they make conditions, then they don't ever want to fulfill them because their own aid industry presses them very hard not to fulfill them, and because other countries will come in and fill the gap. I'm actually a believer in people. I would strongly associate myself with Julian Simon's remark that people are the ultimate resource. And I don't see any reason, well, no, that's not true. I see one reason, and I'll come to it in a minute. But by and large, I think the anti-population movement in the 60s and 70s was an ethical and practical catastrophe. I mean, I think we have no right to interfere in people's most intimate decisions, which is how many children they have. But what does worry me, it clearly is true that the prospects for climate change in the world as a whole are certainly affected by the number of people who are there. So, you know, I'm pro-population, I'm pro more people, but I am indeed very worried about climate change. And I think climate change, you know, is the biggest of the clouds on the horizon. I actually don't worry too much about inequality. I worry about rent-seeking. And innovation, I think, historically has what has made us rich. And even if it generates huge inequalities when it first comes, we should be able to deal with that as societies and make sure that everybody benefits from it. I know that's a difficult problem, but I don't think it's an impossible problem. I think climate change is much harder, and climate change is for sure made much worse if there are many, many more people.
Do you have any idea of what kind of global situation is possible for poverty? Would you rely on market forces, or would you like to see something like a global rule of law at a world level?
Not the latter. I don't think that's feasible. And also, I'm always concerned, I believe, along with Rawls, even though Rawls's followers have denounced him ever since, that these world taxation systems are tyrannical in the end. But there are things I think we can do. I've forgotten the question before that.
What do you think that any kind of transfer is
No,
useful?
I don't like,
No
but there was
transfer.
another bit, no transfers.
Yeah. What else can be done?
Well, there's a huge amount we can
I
do,
was
which
mentioning global rule of law.
global
Rule of law.
rule of law. So, but that's within my global public goods agenda. So we should certainly make it easier for countries to be able to trade in the rich world. We should do things that improve their health, which is, I think, tremendously important. And I also, I know what I wanted to answer was about market forces. I don't think we can do this without market forces, but I don't think we can do it with only market forces. And in fact, much of my message in The Great Escape is sort of attacking the proposition that you don't really have to worry about health in poor countries. And I agree with what you said about the outside, that, you know, health is actually much more important than money when you're thinking about poverty. And so are these other things too, but let's talk about health. Then I think, you know, the market will not deliver health by itself. It never has, and it never will. And health throughout human history, from the 18th century onwards, has depended on public action, on collective action, through governments and through people acting together. And, you know, that's why these children are dying in poor countries today, not because those countries are not rich, but because there is not the capacity to deliver proper health care.
And it is going to be worse because the technological progress in health will create a huge difference between people that can afford the new technologies and people who cannot.
Yeah, but in poor countries, we're talking about people who don't have water. I mean, we don't need those new technologies for those places. New technology can sometimes help.
New drugs, I mean.
Yeah, but the new drugs are not what is going to say. I mean, antihypertensives, which have saved enormous amount of lives in rich countries, could save a lot of lives in poor countries, and they cost nothing. Cancer is a much harder issue, but cancer is going to be a very hard issue for people in France and the United States too, because the drugs cost so much. But, you know, there's an enormous amount of things that can be done to save kids in poor countries without spending a huge amount of money or without having new technology.
And this money will come to whom? To the people or to the government?
I think the government has to be able to do a lot of it. I think in some countries, private healthcare has been important, but private healthcare is no good unless the government is capable of regulating it. So either the government has to deliver the healthcare or it has to be capable of monitoring and regulating the private sector.
When we speak of these issues, there's also a dimension that maybe you should not forget. I would be delighted to hear your views on that, which is that one of the solutions in the Western world since the, would say the 18th century on poverty was migration. Huge migrations.
Yep.
And then we had migration from Italy, from France, not a lot from France, but from Ireland, from UK, to United States, etc. If we take a global view on it, why we would not consider that global migrations could be a solution to poverty? Of course, I know how much it is at stake behind this question, but what do you think about it?
Well, I tend to separate it into, you know, I'm a migrant myself. I'm the last person to say that migration is not really important. But I tend to, I mean, I think this is something where the economics and the politics of the situation go in somewhat different directions. So that if you think of the economics of migration, migration is almost entirely good. It's good for the people who migrate, who get much, much richer when they get to the richer place. It's good for the people they leave back at home, who get remittances.
Can you repeat that? Because a lot of people need to hear that. That migrations are good for people who receive the migrants.
No, I didn't say that.
Yes, you said.
No, I was getting there, but I haven't said it. I haven't
Please,
said
I
it
don't want
yet.
to dictate what you have to say, please.
Yes, you do. No, I mean, I think it's good for the migrants themselves,
Yes.
who get much better off. It's good for the people they leave back home who get
Okay.
remittances.
Okay.
And I think the studies show that it's good for the receiving countries after a while, all right? So that in the long run, there's enormous benefits to migration of many, many different kinds. So I'm in favor of migration from an economic point of view. But you know, I can't come to someone else's country and tell you how many migrants you should take. And that is a political problem that has to be solved by each country on its own terms. But I think the economic things are not properly understood. And a lot of the prejudice against migrants is by people who've never seen one. And you know, the strongest people who are against migration in the United States are people who live in places where there are no migrants. And apparently much the same was true in Brexit too. So I think spreading good information about this is a really important thing to do. And that would help the democratic process of people deciding how many migrants they want to have in their countries.
Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to thank you for coming to join us. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here, and your conversation was very, very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.